village of Netherwallop, nestled snugly in a particularly leafy corner of Hampshire, was the sort of place where time seemed not merely to slow down, but to occasionally stop altogether to admire the roses. It was a village of honey-coloured stone cottages, immaculate hedgerows, and a 12th-century church whose bells chimed with a comforting, if slightly off-key, regularity. On this particular Saturday in late June, Netherwallop was displaying its most charming facade. It was the day of the annual vicarage fete, an event of paramount importance in the village social calendar, second only perhaps to the Christmas carol service, and considerably more stressful for the incumbent vicar, Reverend Septimus Finch, a man whose natural state was one of mild, fluttering anxiety, was today operating at a fever pitch. He darted among the stalls set up on the sprawling vicarage lawn, his cassock kicking up dust, adjusting a precarious stack of tombola prizes here, soothing a ruffled Women's Institute member over the placement of the jam stall there. "Oh dear," Reverend Finch murmured, mopping his high forehead with a damp handkerchief. "If Mrs. Higgins places her Victoria sponge next to Mrs. Gable's seed cake, we shall have a repeat of the Great Crumble War of 1952. And where is the man with the donkey?" Observing this whirlwind of rustic activity from the vantage point of a comfortable wicker chair beneath a sprawling copper beech tree sat Miss Jane Marple. She was currently a guest of her old acquaintance, Mrs. Agnes Witherspoon, a widow, with a large, draughty house just off the village green, and a tendency to agree with the last person who spoke to her. Miss Marple wore a sensible lightweight tweed suit of a soft heather colouring and a small straw hat adorned with a cluster of velvet pansies. To the casual observer there were many Toddash was merely a fluffy, benign old lady, perhaps a great-aunt tucked out of the way with a cup of tea. Her pale blue eyes, however, though gentle, were restlessly busy. They absorbed the scene not as a picturesque tableau, but as a complex woven tapestry of human relationships, debts, grudges, and desires. "It is a lovely turnout, Agnes," Miss Marple remarked softly, her voice like dried leaves rustling. She sat with her knitting bag on her lap, though her needles were currently still. Mrs. Witherspoon fluttered her hands. "Oh, isn't it, Jane? Though poor Septimus is in such a state. He does worry about the finances. The roof of the north aisle is practically held together by prayer and cobwebs." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her gaze shifting. It landed upon a large, red-faced man in a loud checked suit who was loudly dominating the hoopla stall. This was Mr. Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton was a relative newcomer to Netherwallop, having purchased the Grange, the village's largest estate, 3 years prior. He was a man of immense, sudden wealth and very little ancestry, a combination that the village's older families found deeply indigestible. He had a booming laugh that didn't quite reach his small, hard eyes, and a habit of slapping people on the back a little too hard. "Mr. Pendleton seems in high spirits," Miss Marple observed. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Witherspoon whispered conspiratorially. "He's donated the Star Prize for the Grand Auction later this afternoon. An antique silver tea service. Very valuable, they say, though where he got it nobody quite knows. Major Hamilton says it looks suspiciously like the one stolen from Lord Edgington's estate in Kent 10 years ago. But then, the Major has never forgiven Mr. Pendleton for outbidding him on that stretch of fishing river." Miss Marple's eyes moved to Major Hamilton, a rigid military man with a white mustache stained yellow by nicotine. He was currently standing by the coconut shy, glaring at Pendleton's back with undisguised hostility. The Major was a man whose world was shrinking, and he resented anyone who reminded him of the fact. Further along the lawn, near the dense rhododendron bushes that separated the vicarage garden from the untamed woods beyond, Miss Marple noted the vicar's daughter, Rose. She was a pale, pretty girl of 20, currently supposed to be manning the lucky dip. Instead, she was engaged in an intense, whispered conversation with a young man in a leather jacket, Jack Dairy, the mechanic from the garage on the London road. The vicar disapproved of Jack, mostly because Jack owned a motorcycle and lacked a tie. As Miss Marple watched, Rose dabbed at her eyes with a furious gesture, and Jack looked sullenly at the ground. A lover's quarrel, Miss Marple decided, or perhaps something deeper. The tension in the girl's shoulders reminded her of poor Annie Croft back in St. Mary Mead, just before she ran off with that dreadful encyclopedia salesman. The afternoon wore on, under the golden sun. The brass band puffed its way through a medley of Gilbert and Sullivan children shrieked as they failed to win goldfish. The aroma of brewing tea and warm sugar mingled with the scent of crushed grass. It was a perfect illusion of harmony. At 4 o'clock, the festivities paused for the main event, the grand auction. A small dais had been erected near the vicarage's French windows. Reverend Finch mounted it, looking flushed and considerably more ragged than when the day began. He tapped the microphone, producing a sharp feedback squeal that made everyone jump. "Ladies and gentlemen," the vicar began, his voice wavering slightly, "thank you all for your incredible generosity so far. We now come to the highlight of our day, the auction. And to start us off with a truly magnificent donation, I call upon Mr. Arthur Pendleton, who has kindly offered to present the lot himself." The vicar gestured grandly toward the side of the house where Pendleton had last been seen nursing a lukewarm cider. There was silence. The brass band lowered their instruments. A child dropped a toffee apple. "Mr. Pendleton," the vicar repeated, a note of panic creeping in. He craned his neck. The crowd murmured, heads turned. Major Hamilton snorted audibly. "Probably off counting his money," he muttered, to no one in particular. Mrs. Witherspoon clutched Miss Marple's arm. "How very odd. He loves the limelight. He wouldn't miss this." Miss Marple said nothing. She was looking past the crowd toward the edge of the garden where the manicured lawn gave way to the darker, cooler shadows of the rhododendron thicket. 5 minutes passed. The awkwardness thickened into genuine unease. The vicar, now sweating profusely, stepped off the dais. Perhaps he has been delayed, if y'all excuse me." He hurried toward the house, followed by his daughter, Rose, who looked strangely pale, her earlier tearfulness replaced by a rigid tension. It was another 10 minutes before the scream cut through the humid afternoon air. It did not come from home. It came from the bottom of the garden near the sunken ha-ha wall that bordered the woods. It was the piercing, theatrical shriek of Mrs. Higgins, the reigning champion of the Victoria sponge. The crowd surged forward, propelled by that morbid curiosity that lies just beneath the surface of polite society. Miss Marple did not surge. She rose slowly, folding her knitting with deliberate care, and followed in the wake of the throng. When she arrived at the ha-ha, a deep ditch designed to keep livestock out of the garden without interrupting the view, a circle had already formed. The vicar was down in the ditch, his cassock muddy at the knees. There was no sign of Arthur Pendleton, but lying in the long grass at the bottom of the ditch was his loud checkered suit jacket, and nearby, crushed into the mud, was the distinctive Panama hat he had been wearing all afternoon. The vicar looked up, his face grey in the late afternoon light. In his hand, he held something small and glittering that he had plucked from the lapel of the abandoned jacket. "He's not here," Reverend Finch whispered, his voice trembling with a horror that seemed out of proportion to a mere absence. "He's just gone." The brass band struck up a hesitant rendition of "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow," then trailed off miserably as the conductor realized the inappropriateness of the tune. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long, spindly shadows across the lawn. The warmth of the day evaporated instantly, replaced by a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Miss Marple stood at the back of the crowd, her eyes fixed not on the jacket in the ditch, but on the faces of the people around, hearth relief on Major Hamilton's face, the terrifying blankness in Rose Finch's eyes, the sudden, sharp interest of the village gossip, Mrs. Vance. The peace of Netherwallop had been shattered. The vanishing of Arthur Pendleton had begun. By Monday morning, the village of Netherwallop was practically humming with speculative energy, vibrating like a plucked violin string. The local constabulary had been summoned, of course. Inspector Davies, a stout man who preferred his cases to involve stolen bicycles rather than missing millionaires, had spent a fruitless Sunday tramping through the rhododendrons and poking at the mud in the ha-ha ditch. He had departed with Pendleton's loud checkered jacket and Panama hat, safely sealed in brown paper bags, leaving behind a vacuum that the villagers were only too eager to fill with their own deductions. The epicenter of this investigative frenzy was the village shop and post office run by the formidable Mrs. Gable. At any given moment, a minimum of 4 people were crammed between the racks of seed packets and the tins of shortbread, ostensibly purchasing necessities but truly bartering information. Miss Jane Marple, requiring a fresh book of first-class stamps and a quarter-pound of humbugs, found herself gently buffeted against a display of knitting patterns. She arranged her face into an expression of mild, slightly deaf befuddlement and simply listened. "I am telling you, it's London gangs," declared Mrs. Higgins, her voice vibrating with dramatic certainty as she selected a cabbage. "A man doesn't just evaporate from a vicarage lawn. He had enemies. Look how he threw his money around, that silver tea service he bragged about, probably stolen. They came down in a black motor car, dragged him into the woods, and that is the last we shall see of Arthur Pendleton." Major Hamilton, who was waiting impatiently for his daily newspaper, let out a sharp, derisive snort. "Balderdash, madam, gangs in Netherwallop. He's a bounder who finally overreached himself. Dodgy investments, I shouldn't wonder. He realized the jig was up, shed his coat to make it look like foul play, and hopped a train to the continent. The man always struck me as a coward, but his motor car is still parked at the Grange," timidly offered Mrs. Witherspoon, who had accompanied Miss Marple. "And his housekeeper said his bed hadn't been slept in. It's terribly sad." "Do you suppose he might have had a turn?" Wandered off into the woods in a state of confusion. "If he had a turn, he'd be lying under a bush, not spirited away into thin air," the Major countered gruffly. Miss Marple paid for her stamps, her fluffy white hair nodding in apparent agreement with everyone and no one. She found the theories fascinating, not for their accuracy, but for what they revealed about the speakers. Mrs. Higgins, whose own life was spectacularly dull, craved melodrama. Major Hamilton, who despised Pendleton's newly acquired wealth, preferred a narrative that painted the man as a financial fraud and a coward. Stepping out of the bell-chiming shop into the crisp morning air, Miss Marple paused to adjust her scarf. Across the village green she spotted Reverend Finch hurrying toward the church, his shoulders stooped under an invisible weight. Trailing a few paces behind him was his daughter, Rose. Miss Marple observed the young woman closely. During the fete, Rose had been a portrait of pale, weeping distress while arguing with that young mechanic, Jack Dairy. But now, amidst a village gripped by the shocking disappearance of a prominent resident, Rose's demeanor had fundamentally shifted. She did not look frightened, nor did she look curious like the women in the post office. Instead, as Rose glanced over her shoulder toward the woods where Pendleton had vanished, Miss Marple recognized a very specific tightening around the girl's mouth. It was a look she had seen on the face of a parlour maid in St. Mary Mead, who had just successfully swept a broken teacup under the rug. It was the distinct, unmistakable look of profound relief. "A penny for your thoughts, Jane," Mrs. Witherspoon asked, linking her arm through Miss Marple's. "Do you think the poor man was murdered?" "I think," Miss Marple murmured, patting her friend's hand, "that human beings are remarkably quick to construct a puzzle that fits their own preferred picture. And I think that before we wonder who might have taken Mr. Pendleton away, we ought to consider who is most grateful that he is no longer here." She set off across the green, her mind quietly cataloguing the hidden resentments of Netherwallop, ready to pull at the loose threads until the whole neatly knitted facade began to unravel. The morning was crystalline and bright, sweeping away the weekend's humidity under perfectly clear skies. Miss Marple, armed with a trug basket and a pair of secateurs, had volunteered to assist Reverend Finch in deadheading the vicarage roses. It was an occupation that provided excellent cover for being exactly where one was not supposed to be. The police presence had intensified. Inspector Davies had returned, this time accompanied by a sharp-eyed sergeant and a team of constables who were systematically combing the woods beyond the ha-ha. Reverend Finch was in no fit state for horticulture. He paced the terrace, his hands clasped behind his back, looking more like a condemned man than a spiritual leader. Miss Marple snipped a withered Dorothy Perkins and watched him. His anxiety seemed entirely out of proportion for a man who had merely lost a wealthy, if vulgar, parishioner. It was the frantic, trapped pacing of a man concealing a very immediate personal terror. From behind a sprawling trellis, Miss Marple observed the kitchen door swing open. Rose Finch slipped out, carrying a basket of laundry. She did not head for the washing line. Instead, she moved with urgent, hushed steps toward the lich gate, where the shadow of the church tower provided a convenient veil. Waiting there, leaning against the ancient stone, was Jack Dairy. He wore the same sullen expression as Saturday, but his hands, normally thrust deep into his pockets, were gripping Rose's shoulders. Miss Marple snipped another rose. inching slightly closer along the gravel path. The acoustics of the vicarage garden were remarkably generous. She could not hear every word, but the cadence of the exchange was unmistakable. It was not a romantic tryst, it was a frantic negotiation. Rose was pleading, her face turned up toward the young mechanic, while Jack shook his head repeatedly, a stubborn set to his jaw. He handed her a small folded paper before turning abruptly and striding away toward the village green. Rose stared after him, her posture rigid, before shoving the item deep into her apron pocket. Fascinating, Miss Marple breathed to herself, dropping the dead rose head into her basket. Her reverie was interrupted by the heavy crunch of Inspector Davis' boots on the gravel. He approached the vicar, his notebook already drawn. Miss Marple remained perfectly still behind the trellis, blending into the foliage like a benign, tweed-clad insect. "Reverend," the inspector began, his tone lacking its usual rural deference. "We've finished our sweep of the woods. No sign of Mr. Pendleton, but we did find something curious near the old stone bridge. A set of tire tracks, fresh, leading away onto the London road. Not the sort of tracks from Pendleton's motorcar, which is still sitting in his driveway. These were much narrower, like a motorcycle." The Reverend stumbled backward as if physically struck. He collapsed onto a nearby stone bench, his face ashen. "A motorcycle," he repeated, the words escaping him in a ragged exhale. Miss Marple watched his eyes dart instinctively toward the kitchen door, where Rose had just retreated. The vicar knew exactly who in the village possessed a motorcycle capable of navigating that narrow woodland path. "Does that mean something to you, sir?" the inspector pressed, his eyes narrowing. The vicar hurriedly shook his head, a poor lie painted clearly across his sweating brow. He mumbled something about the local youths using the woods as a shortcut, completely failing to sound convincing. The inspector did not press the issue immediately, but he made a deliberate note in his little book. Miss Marple silently retreated from the trellis. The puzzle pieces were beginning to form a picture, though the edges were still frustratingly blurred. Arthur Pendleton had vanished, leaving behind his coat and hat to simulate an abduction or a violent end in the garden ditch. Yet, a motorcycle had sped away from the woods shortly after. Jack Dairy owned a motorcycle. Rose Finch was terrified, and the vicar was lying to the police to protect someone. But Pendleton, a man of wealth and loud boasts, did not fit naturally into the world of a young garage mechanic and a vicar's daughter. She needed to understand the connection. The secret did not lie in the mud of the ha-ha or the tire tracks by the bridge. It lay in the human heart, in the quiet, desperate things people did when they felt trapped. Miss Marple decided it was time to visit the garage on the London road, perhaps to inquire about a phantom rattle in her friend's bicycle, and see what the sullen Mr. Dairy had to say for himself. Thick fog rolled off the Hampshire Downs by Tuesday morning, wrapping Netherwallop in a damp, grey embrace that muffled the church bells and obscured the elm trees. The village felt shrunken, isolated from the world, creating an atmosphere that felt altogether too intimate for comfort. Miss Marple, wrapped securely in a thick tweed coat and a sensible wool scarf, navigated the edge of the London road with deliberate care. Beside her, she pushed Mrs. Witherspoon's ancient black bicycle, an unwieldy contraption that clicked rhythmically with every revolution of its tires. The local garage was a utilitarian cinder-block structure that squatted unattractively at the village boundary, smelling pungently of petrol, damp earth, and old rubber. As Miss Marple approached through the swirling mist, the sound of raised voices cut through the quiet. She paused, leaning the bicycle carefully against a low brick wall, and adjusted her scarf, making herself as inconspicuous as a shadow against the grey stone. Inside the open bay doors, illuminated by the harsh glare of a single overhead bulb, stood Inspector Davies. He looked profoundly triumphant, his thumbs tucked into his belt, radiating the specific satisfaction of a man who believed his work was nearly done. Facing him, his back pressed defensively against a workbench cluttered with oily rags and spanners, was Jack Dairy. The young mechanic's face was smeared with grease, but beneath the grime, his skin was terribly pale. "It is no use lying, Dairy," the inspector barked, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "We found the tire tracks down by the stone bridge. Matches your Norton motorcycle perfectly. And we have 3 witnesses who heard an engine gunning away from the woods exactly 10 minutes after Arthur Pendleton was last seen at the vicarage." Jack crossed his arms tightly across his chest, his jaw set in a stubborn, unyielding line. I was riding my bike. It is not a crime to ride a motorcycle on a public path. I didn't see Pendleton. I haven't seen the man all week. Is that so? The inspector took a step closer, his tone becoming dangerously soft. Then perhaps you can explain why Pendleton's ledger, which we found in his study last night, lists a debt of £200 owed by one Jack Dairy, a loan you took to keep this failing garage afloat, a loan he was demanding you repay by the end of the month. Miss Marple, standing perfectly still outside the bay doors, felt a mild flutter of interest. A debt of £200 was a substantial sum, certainly enough to provide a desperate young man with a motive. It was the classic, obvious solution. The wealthy, unpleasant man threatens the impoverished, hot-headed youth, a confrontation occurs in the woods, a struggle ensues, and the wealthy man vanishes. It was neat. It was tidy. It was exactly the sort of solution Inspector Davies preferred. I was going to pay him back, Jack said, his voice dropping to a sullen mutter. His eyes, however, darted nervously toward the corner of the garage, where his motorcycle sat covered by a heavy tarpaulin. With what? Davies scoffed. You barely make enough to patch bicycle tires. You met him in the woods, you argued. Things got out of hand. Where is he, Dairy? Where did you put him? Miss Marple watched the young man's hands. While his posture was defensive and angry, his hands were entirely still, gripping his own forearms with white-knuckled intensity. A man accused of murder, she had often observed, usually protested with his hands issuing wildly, pleading, or clenching his fists in genuine rage. Jack Dairy was not doing that. He was holding himself together by sheer force of will, like a man terrified that if he relaxed for a single second, a much more dangerous truth would spill out. He is not protecting himself, Miss Marple deduced quietly, her sharp blue eyes missing nothing. He is protecting someone else. The crumpled note Rose Finch had shoved into her apron pocket yesterday flashed in her mind. I want a solicitor, Jack finally said, his voice flat and dead. I am not saying another word to you. The inspector sighed heavily, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his coat. Suit yourself, lad. But you are coming with me to the station. We can continue this conversation in a cell. As the inspector led the young mechanic out into the fog, Miss Marple remained perfectly still until the police vehicle disappeared down the road. She quietly entered the garage. The air was thick with the smell of despair. She approached the motorcycle, lifting the tarp rim just enough to inspect the machine. The tires were clean. There was no mud on the mudguards, no damp leaves clinging to the spokes. It was a pristine machine that had not been ridden through a muddy woodland path in days. The inspector had matched a tread, but he had failed to look at the actual vehicle. Jack Dairy was an obvious suspect, perfectly framed by circumstance and debt, but he was innocent of this particular crime. The true puzzle was why he was so incredibly willing to let the police believe otherwise. A brisk, biting wind had swept away the morning fog by early afternoon, leaving the sky a brilliant, bruised purple and whipping the branches of the copper beech into a frenzy. Miss Marple, her sensible tweed coat buttoned firmly to her chin, made her way steadily back to the vicarage. The sprawling lawn, normally a picture of pastoral tranquility, was a melancholy sight. The abandoned stalls of the Fate stood like skeletal remains, their canvas awnings flapping miserably in the gale. Under the guise of searching for a misplaced tortoiseshell knitting needle, she had returned to the scene of the vanishing. She bypassed the tombola and the dismantled coconut shy, her gaze fixed on the treacherous sunken boundary of the ha-ha. The local police had strung a piece of crude twine between two stakes to mark the area where Arthur Pendleton's loud jacket and Panama hat had been discovered. Inspector Davies and his men had trampled the grass on the woodland side, searching for the path an attacker might have taken while dragging a heavy, unconscious man. Miss Marple, however, did not look toward the woods. She stood on the garden side, leaning slightly over the steep drop, her pale blue eyes scanning the damp earth at the bottom of the ditch. The earth down there was a thick, cloying clay, softened by the dampness of the ravine. A man of Mr. Pendleton's substantial girth, easily 15 stone, she estimate falling or being pushed into that ditch would have left deep, chaotic craters in the mud. There should have been the frantic gouges of a struggle, or the heavy, dragging trenches of a body being hauled upward into the woods. But the surface of the mud, though scuffed by the inspector's boots nearby, was remarkably undisturbed exactly where the clothing had rested. The grass was flattened, yes, but the earth beneath it bore no deep indentations. It was as if the jacket and hat had been gently laid down from above, rather than dropped in a moment of violent panic. Miss Marple pursed her lips, a thoughtful hum barely audible over the wind. A staged scene, a theatrical departure designed specifically to look like foul play. She adjusted her spectacles, her gaze tracking the brickwork of the ha-ha wall. About a foot below the edge, snagged tightly around a jagged chip in the masonry, something fluttered weakly. It was incredibly small, nearly invisible against the grey stone. Miss Marple retrieved a silver hairpin from her pocket, leaned cautiously over the precipice, and managed to hook the tiny object. It was a single, tightly coiled thread of pale blue wool. It was not the rough, utilitarian yarn of a mechanic's jumper, nor was it the heavy worsted material of a loudly checked suit. It was a delicate, expensive Angora blend. Miss Marple rolled the thread between her thumb and forefinger, cataloguing the texture with the precision of a lifelong knitter. She remembered the feast perfectly. She remembered Reverend Finch, frantic pacing Major Hamilton's nicotine-stained mustache, and Mr. Pendleton's booming, hollow laugh. Most vividly, she remembered the pale, distressed figure of Rose Finch, shivering in the afternoon heat, wearing a delicate, pale blue Angora cardigan. The young woman had been standing nowhere near the ha-ha when the scream echoed across the lawn. She had been near her father. Yet, here was a piece of her cardigan, snagged securely on the rough brickwork exactly where the missing man's clothes had been deposited. The implication was as clear as a rung bell. Rose Finch had visited the ditch before the alarm was raised. She had carefully placed the jacket and hat in the mud, catching her sleeve on the masonry as she reached down. The puzzle pieces shifted drastically. Jack Dairy's fierce, silent protection in the garage suddenly made sense. He was not shielding himself from a murder charge, he was shielding the vicar's daughter from an investigation into a faked disappearance. But why would a sheltered young woman help a loathsome millionaire stage his own vanishing act? Miss Marple tucked the blue thread carefully into her coin purse, the wind tugging at her hat. The answer, she suspected, was hidden somewhere inside the gloomy, anxious walls of the vicarage itself. It was time to pay Reverend Finch a neighbourly visit. A sharp, unseasonal frost had seized Nether Wallop by late afternoon, glazing the remaining bunting on the vicarage lawn with an icy sheen. The temperature had plummeted, turning the mud of the ha-ha into iron and biting through the thickest tweed. Miss Marple, however, did not hasten her steps. She approached the heavy oak door with the measured pace of a woman who had all the time in the world, though she knew Jack Dairy, sitting in a cell, certainly did not. She lifted the iron knocker and let it fall. The sound echoed hollowly within the stone walls. It was several moments before the door was pulled open by Reverend Finch. The man looked utterly haggard. His usually neat collar was askew, and the skin beneath his eyes was bruised with exhaustion. He managed a wavering smile upon seeing his visitor. "Miss Marple," he murmured, ushering her into the draughty hallway. "How kind of you to call. We are 6 and 7 here. The police, the village gossip, it is all rather overwhelming. It is a terrible strain on you, Vicar," Miss Marple replied soothingly, unwinding her scarf. "I merely came to return the secateurs I borrowed this morning, and to inquire if there is any way I might be of assistance. In times of crisis, I find a strong cup of tea and a bit of mundane mending can do wonders for the nerves." She followed him into the sitting room. It was a sombre space, dominated by dark furniture and a fireplace that held only a meagre blaze. Huddled in a wing-back chair near the hearth was Rose Finch. She looked up as they entered, her eyes red-rimmed and guarded. Miss Marple noted instantly that the young woman was wearing a heavy, dark green wool jumper, a stark departure from the delicate pastels she usually favoured. "Good afternoon, Rose, my dear," Miss Marple said cheerfully, taking a seat and placing her knitting bag on her lap. "You look frozen through. The cold came so suddenly, didn't it? Much like that dreadful winter of '47. I remember my nephew Raymond snagged his favourite blue scarf on a frozen bramble that year. Completely ruined the garment." Rose flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a sudden tightening of the knuckles against the armrest, but Miss Marple caught it. The vicar, busy poking uselessly at the fire, noticed nothing. "I was just telling the inspector," Reverend Finch sighed, abandoning the poker, "that we have absolutely no idea who could have wished Arthur ill. He was a difficult man, yes, but to orchestrate such a vanishing, Orchestrate is a very interesting word, Vicar, Miss Marple mused, pulling a half-finished baby booty from her bag. Her needles began to click with a comforting rhythmic sound. It implies a conductor, someone directing the players. The police seem to think young Jack Dairy is the principal actor in this particular drama. They arrested him this morning, you know. A strangled gasp escaped Rose. She half rose from her chair, her face draining of what little colour it possessed. Arrested? Jack? But he didn't do anything. He couldn't have. The police found his tyre tracks near the woods, Miss Marple stated mildly, not looking up from her knitting, and a ledger showing a rather substantial debt to Mr. Pendleton. They believe he had a motive and the opportunity. That is absurd, Rose shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. She turned to her father, who was staring at the floor, his face pale and shining with cold sweat. Father, you must tell them. You must tell them it wasn't Jack. Rose, please, the vicar whispered, his voice trembling. We cannot interfere. The police must do their job. But he is innocent, she pleaded, tears finally spilling over her lashes. He was only trying to help me. He only rode his motorcycle down that path to draw attention away from the garden. The sitting room plunged into a thick, suffocating silence. The click-clack of Miss Marple's knitting needles stopped. She looked up, her blue eyes piercingly bright in the dim room. To draw attention away, my dear? Miss Marple asked gently. Away from you placing Mr. Pendleton's jacket and hat in the ditch. The blue Angora wool on the brickwork was quite a giveaway, I must admit. The vicar collapsed into the nearest chair, burying his face in his hands with a ragged sob. Rose stood frozen, staring at the fluffy, benign old lady as if a venomous snake had just uncoiled itself from the knitting bag. The carefully constructed walls of the vicarage were finally coming down, brick by desperate brick. The silence in the vicarage sitting room was absolute, broken only by the soft hiss of the meagre fire and the sudden realization that it had begun to snow. Thick flakes drifted past the leaded windows, a pristine white veil descending over Nether Wallop, burying the frozen mud under a blanket of quiet. Miss Marple did not break the stillness. She merely waited, her knitting needles resting in her lap, her blue eyes fixed with gentle expectation upon the crumbling clergyman and his terrified daughter. Reverend Finch let out a breath that was half a sob, his shoulders slumping as if an invisible scaffold had finally given way. It was not murder, Miss Marple, I swear it before God. We did not harm a hair on Arthur Pendleton's head. We only helped him leave. Father? No, Rose whispered, her face buried in her hands. It is no use, my dear, the vicar said, his voice hollow. She knows, and Jack is in a cell because of our cowardice. He looked up, begging for understanding. Pendleton came to me on Friday. He was undone by terror. He claimed his past had caught up with him dangerous associates from London. He said they were coming, and if he didn't vanish entirely, they would kill him. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking softly. And he required your assistance to orchestrate this grand illusion. He blackmailed me, the vicar confessed, shame flushing his pale cheeks. I foolishly borrowed a large sum from him to repair the church roof. I could never repay it. He held my reputation in his hands. He demanded I help him create a diversion during the fete. He would slip away, while Rose planted his clothes in the ditch to make it look as though he had been attacked. Jack Dairy only found out because he caught Rose crying. He insisted on riding his motorcycle down the path to lay a false trail and ensure the police looked away. It was a desperate plan. It was a highly effective plan, Miss Marple corrected. It provided Mr. Pendleton with the perfect smokescreen. The entire village, and indeed the police, believed him the victim of a violent abduction. He was free to walk away into a new life, leaving you and Mr. Dairy to face the consequences. We thought he was safe, Rose murmured, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her heavy green jumper. We thought once he was gone, the debt would vanish with him, and we could finally breathe. Human nature, my dear Rose, is rarely so accommodating, Miss Marple observed, turning the heel of the tiny woolen booty. When a man builds a life on deception, his departure is seldom clean. Before she could elaborate, a frantic, thunderous pounding rattled the heavy oak front door. It was a violent sound that shattered the quiet intimacy of the confession. Reverend Finch jumped, his face draining of colour. He hurried into the hallway, pulling the door open to the swirling snow. Standing on the threshold was Major Hamilton, his coat dusted with white flakes, his breath coming in ragged, steaming gasps. His usually rigid, military bearing was completely shattered. Behind him, hovering in the snowy gloom, was the frantic figure of Mrs. Witherspoon. "Finn!" the Major barked, pushing past the Vicar into the hallway. "You must come at once. Call that blasted Inspector Davies. Call everyone." "Major, what on earth has happened?" Miss Marple asked, stepping calmly out of the sitting room, her knitting bag tucked neatly over her arm. Major Hamilton removed his cap, his hands shaking visibly. He looked at the Vicar, then at Miss Marple, his eyes wide with a horrific discovery. "It is Pendleton," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper against the howling snow. "We were organizing a search party to check the old abandoned ice house on the Grange estate, just in case he had wandered in there for shelter. The roof partially caved in under the weight of the snow." Rose let out a sharp gasp. "Is he hiding there?" "He is not hiding," the Major said grimly. "He is lying on the stone floor. His head has been stove in with a heavy iron crowbar. He is stone dead, Finch. He never left the village at all." Miss Marple absorbed this chilling revelation without a flinch. The puzzle had entirely inverted itself. Arthur Pendleton had staged a theatrical disappearance to escape his enemies, but someone in Nether Wallop had used that very deception as the perfect, brilliant cover to murder him. The biting frost of Tuesday morning held the village of Nether Wallop in a sparkling, unforgiving grip. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue, and the thick snow from the previous evening had frozen into a treacherous crust over the village green. Inside the warmly lit, oak-panelled parlour of the Red Lion Inn, a subdued congregation of locals had gathered seeking solace and warmth. The usual cheerful clatter of teacups and the low murmur of harmless village gossip had been completely replaced by a heavy, frightened silence. Murder, cold and utterly brutal, had finally visited their peaceful doorstep. Miss Marple sat in a quiet, shadowed corner near the crackling hearth, a cup of untouched Earl Grey cooling on the small table beside her. Her knitting needles moved with a steady, mesmerizing rhythm, crafting a pale yellow booty. Across the room, Major Hamilton stood rigid by the frosted window, staring out at the frozen, desolate landscape. His military bearing was stiff and unyielding, though his fingers tapped a restless, highly erratic rhythm against the wooden windowsill. Inspector Davies had released young Jack Dairy late last night, grudgingly acknowledging the mechanic could not have been in the ice house and the woods simultaneously. The shocking revelation of Reverend Finch's coerced deception had complicated the timeline, but it had also provided the real killer with an immaculate, ready-made alibi. While the village looked frantically at the ha-ha ditch, someone else had slipped away to the ice house. Miss Marple neatly cast off a row of stitches, gathered her yarn, and approached the window. "It is a beautiful, terrible morning, is it not, Major?" she observed mildly, her voice barely rising above the hiss of the fire. Hamilton started slightly, turning sharply. "Miss Marple, yes, dreadful business. To think the blighter was lying in the ice house all along, while we were making absolute fools of ourselves dragging the woods." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes serene. "A masterful misdirection. The killer utilized Mr. Pendleton's own staged Vanishing as the perfect cloak for a real murder. They must have known of his plan or simply followed him when he slipped away, seizing an unexpected opportunity." The Major scoffed, a harsh sound. "The man had enemies everywhere. Brash, vulgar fellow. Probably invited some London thug down for a secret meeting and the deal went sour. Struck him down with that rusty old crowbar and fled." "That is the prevailing theory," Miss Marple nodded. Inspector Davies mentioned the crowbar was wiped completely clean of fingerprints. "A highly professional touch," he noted. She let the silence stretch, a delicate, tensile thread drawn taut between them. However, Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational. "I find myself terribly puzzled by one small detail, the location. The old ice house is hidden deep within the overgrown shrubbery. Mr. Pendleton was hardly a man who explored historical ruins. He preferred modern comforts. To conduct a clandestine meeting in a freezing, crumbling stone pit seems incredibly out of character for him." Hamilton cleared his throat loudly. "Perhaps the thug chose the meeting place. Perhaps," Miss Marple conceded gently. "But the crowbar, Major," the inspector assumed it was a weapon of opportunity found inside the ice house. Yet, Mrs. Gable at the post office mentioned this very morning that she sold a heavy iron crowbar exactly like it last Thursday, to a prominent local resident. Hamilton's face remained a rigid mask, but a faint sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. "Anyone could have bought a tool, madam. The village is full of men doing repairs." Miss Marple looked directly into his eyes, stripping away her benign facade. Yes, they could. But the unwrapped crowbar found next to poor Mr. Pendleton had a tiny, distinct fleck of red paint on its handle, the exact shade of red used on the newly painted gate of your cottage, Major Hamilton. The silence that followed was suffocating. The colour drained entirely from Hamilton's face, leaving his skin grey. "I noticed you painting it on Friday afternoon," Miss Marple added softly. "You must have laid the heavy iron tool down on the wet paint while you worked. A careless, unavoidable mistake, but human nature is fraught with them." She did not raise her voice, nor did she accuse him directly. She simply laid the facts out, a neatly woven trap requiring no force to spring. The Major's eyes darted frantically toward the door, calculating the distance, measuring his fading odds. In that single, desperate glance, his composure shattered, and he gave away everything. Miss Marple sighed, returning to her seat, the psychological game thoroughly and decisively won. The heavy silence in the parlour of the Red Lion stretched into eternity, magnifying the crackle of the hearth and the ragged breathing of Major Hamilton. He stood frozen by the frosted window, trapped not by iron bars, but by the gentle logic of an old woman with a knitting bag. Before he could formulate a lie, the heavy oak door connecting to the private dining room swung open. Inspector Davies stepped through, notebook in hand, his expression caught between professional grimness and profound astonishment. Miss Marple had quietly suggested he listen from the adjacent room, presenting it merely as a request for his comforting presence. "I believe, Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, "that Major Hamilton has a few things he might wish to explain, though, if he prefers, I can outline the sequence of events as they so clearly unfolded." Hamilton glared, his rigid posture finally crumbling. He sank into a wooden chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. It was his laugh, the Major whispered bitterly, that booming, hollow, triumphant laugh. He took everything, the fishing rights, the respect of the county, and finally he purchased the very promissory notes that held my ancestral home. He was going to evict me, Davies, a man of my standing, thrown out by a vulgar trickster. And so, Miss Marple continued, her tone holding no judgment, only a deep, melancholy understanding of human frailty. "When you observed him slipping away from his feet on Saturday, you saw your opportunity. You did not know about his elaborate arrangement with Reverend Finch to stage a disappearance. You only saw a man you despised, walking alone toward the abandoned ice house on the edge of his estate." She turned toward the inspector, ensuring he followed the dual threads. "Myster. Pendleton intended to hide in the ice house until nightfall, waiting for his hired motor car to collect him on the London road. The vicar's daughter, poor Rose, planted the jacket and hat in the ditch to draw the village's attention, while young Jack Dairy provided the auditory illusion of a fleeing culprit on his motorcycle." Inspector Davies frowned, putting the pieces together. A perfect smokescreen. Everyone was looking the wrong way. "But the Major..." "The Major," Miss Marple nodded sadly, "simply followed Mr. Pendleton into the woods. You had already purchased the heavy iron crowbar from Mrs. Gable the day before, intending to pry open the rusted gates of your own stables. When you saw your tormentor vulnerable and isolated in the ice house, the temptation proved too great. The heavy tool, tainted by the wet red paint of your cottage gate, became a weapon of opportunity." Hamilton did not look up. He turned around and smiled at me. "He told me I was trespassing on his land. I struck him before I even realized I had raised my arm. It was over in a second. I left him there, locked the heavy wooden door from the outside, and walked back to his feet." "Where you joined the search party," Miss Marple added, and loudly proclaimed that Mr. Pendleton had likely fled to the continent to escape his debts. "You directed the narrative, ensuring the police believed the staged Vanishing at the Ha-Ha was the genuine article. You must have felt remarkably safe when Reverend Finch's deception came to light, providing you with a fabricated but highly convincing murder plot. But why direct the search party to the ice house yesterday?" the inspector asked, writing furiously. "Because of the snow," Miss Marple explained, picking up her yellow yarn once more. "The blizzard threatened to collapse the ruined roof completely. If the body was buried under tons of masonry and ice, it might not be discovered until the spring thaw. The Major needed the body found while the false clues at the vicarage were still fresh in everyone's minds. He volunteered to lead the search, discovering the tragic scene himself to control the outcome. She looked at the broken man in the chair. A military man understands the importance of seizing the initiative, but a gardener, Major Hamilton, understands that seeds planted in the dark will inevitably push their way into the light. The red paint, the sudden urgency to search a ruined outbuilding, your profound relief when the jacket was found was a pattern of behavior that simply did not belong to an innocent bystander. Inspector Davies stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Hamilton's shoulder. The Major offered no resistance. As the handcuffs clicked into place, his pride finally extinguished. Miss Marple watched them leave, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. The truth had been unearthed, but the village of Nether Wallop would carry the scars of this deception for a very long time. By the following Sunday, the snow had begun to melt, leaving the village of Nether Wallop in a state of dripping grey transition. The pristine white blanket that had covered the scene of the tragedy was now reduced to slushy patches in the shadows of the hedgerows, and the gurgle of water in the stone gutters provided a melancholy soundtrack to the morning. The scandal had broken the village's quiet rhythm, and while the physical evidence of the crime was being packed away into police files, the emotional residue remained as thick as the Hampshire mud. Miss Marple stood once more on the vicarage lawn, though the festive atmosphere of the previous week felt like a memory from a different century. The empty stalls had been removed, leaving only yellowing squares of flattened grass where they had stood. Reverend Finch stood beside her, his clerical collar looking a size too large for his now sunken neck. He watched the workers repairing the north aisle of the church, the very project that had inadvertently set this chain of disasters into motion. "I have spoken with the bishop," the Reverend said, his voice barely audible. "He has been surprisingly merciful, but I do not know if I can continue here, Jane. Every time I look at that ha-ha, I see my own weakness. I see the deception I forced upon my daughter." Miss Marple adjusted her woolen gloves, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was struggling to pierce the heavy clouds. "We are all frail, Septimus. Human nature is not a garden that stays perfectly weeded. It is a wild thing that requires constant, often painful attention. You acted out of a desire to save your church, and Rose acted out of a desire to save you. Those are not ignoble motives, even if they led you into a very dark wood." Rose Finch joined them then, walking across the lawn with Jack Dairy. The young mechanic looked uncomfortable in a stiff Sunday suit, but he held Rose's hand with a fierce, protective grip that suggested the ordeal had forged a bond far stronger than a mere village romance. They were planning to leave Nether Wallop, Jack had whispered to Miss Marple earlier, to start fresh in a town where no one knew the story of the vanished millionaire or the blood-stained crowbar. "The village will talk, of course," Miss Marple continued, turning to the young couple with a small, encouraging smile. "They will whisper over their tea and speculate at the post office until a new scandal arrives to take its place. That is the way of small towns everywhere. I remember a similar situation in St. Mary Mead involving a retired colonel and a missing set of silver spoons. It took 3 years and a very shocking elopement before the village moved on." Mrs. Witherspoon fluttered toward them from the direction of the house, looking both exhausted and oddly invigorated by her proximity to such high drama. "Jane, dear, the car is here to take you to the station. Are you sure you won't stay another week? The tension is finally starting to lift, and I hear Mrs. Gable is planning a special tea to benefit the Major's legal defense fund, though, of course, no one is quite sure if that is proper. I think it is time I returned home, Agnes," Miss Marple said gently. "My own garden is calling, and I suspect my maid, Cherry, has been far too lenient with the dusting in my absence. Besides, a village in the aftermath of a storm needs to find its own way back to the light." As the motor car pulled away from the vicarage, Miss Marple looked out the rear window at the receding spire of the church, of Major Hamilton sitting in his cold cell, a man undone by the very pride he had sought to protect. She thought of Arthur Pendleton, whose wealth had purchased him only a lonely death in a frozen pit. It was a sobering reminder that beneath the most charming facadesque roses, the tea parties, the polite nods on the village green lay the same old human passions: greed, fear, and the desperate need to be respected. Car passed the London Road garage. For a brief moment the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the wet pavement. Miss Marple opened her knitting bag and pulled out the small yellow booty she had been working on. She needed to finish the pair. A new life was beginning for someone, somewhere, and it was always better to be prepared. The mystery of the vanishing was solved, but the mystery of why people did the things they did would remain her life's work, a puzzle that never truly reached its final piece. She settled back into the leather seat, the rhythmic click of her needles providing the only sound as the village of Netherwallop disappeared into the mist behind her.